Chapter 601. Ethan strode up to Olivia, pulling her into his embrace right away. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. I happened to see someone getting bullied, so I helped out." After explaining, Olivia looked at Mara. "I can show the receipt for the dress, and I also have a photo of the dress hanging in the closet at home. But Miss Hudson, what evidence can you provide?" Seeing that Olivia was getting serious, Mara had no choice but to keep insisting. "My manager was the one who borrowed it. She has the receipt." "All right, then call your manager over. Ask her where she borrowed it from. She can help support your claim too. She just left for some urgent business. I can't get her here, can I?" "So, you don't have any evidence, and you also falsely accused someone and lied about the price. This is extortion, isn't it?" Mara said nervously. "Extortion? Quit trying to slander me." "Fine, I can't afford to mess with someone high and mighty like you, Mrs. Miller. I'll just take it as a loss." Mara didn't dare to go up against Ethan. So, she found an excuse and fled the scene. If this went on, they might figure out that she was wearing a counterfeit. If they wanted to get to the bottom of this incident, she would be done for. Olivia looked at the man at the side, whose head was lowered. "Be more careful next time. If you get into trouble like this in the future, don't give in so easily." "Thank you very much, miss. You were a huge help." After thanking her, the janitor hobbled away. Olivia sighed silently as she watched him leave. There were too many people like him. She could help them once, but she couldn't help them forever. Looking away, she was about to leave with Ethan. But then, she noticed that Ethan was still staring at the janitor. "Do you pity him, Ethan?" Ethan had a complicated expression on his face as he nodded. "Let's go back." "Okay." After the fuss, Olivia didn't want to be the center of attention. So, she left hand in hand with Ethan. When they passed by Kelvin, Ethan whispered an order to him before getting into the car. "Understood, Mr. Miller." Kelvin hastily left. Olivia paused in her steps, looking at him. "What's the matter?" "Nothing. Let's go." Reaching out, Ethan patted her on the head. Then, he opened the car door for her. It was snowing heavily outside. The snow looked extra pretty under the streetlights. As Mara made a call, she complained, "Damn it, I bumped into a tricky fellow today. That beggar was already going to pay up, but I ended up wasting a dress. She thinks she's all that just because she's rich." After hanging up, she was about to rub her hands together. The weather was too cold. The light from the streetlight stretched his shadow into the distance. When she examined the man in detail, she realized that he was wearing a janitor's uniform. Mara wasn't scared anymore when she realized that it was the janitor from before. "What are you doing here?" Mara was elated to find that the escaped prey had come back running. "At least you're decent enough. I don't want that much anymore. You only have to give me $100,000. The man was wearing a cap. She couldn't see his eyes under the brim at all. "All right, I'll give it to you." The man's voice sounded extra eerie on a night like this. When Mara saw him hobbling toward her, she suddenly felt that something was off. Goosebumps appeared on her skin, and her sixth sense told her to run away. She was about to leave when the man moved quickly, choking her. Mara wanted to struggle, but she realized that she was powerless in his hands. Her eyes widened as she fearfully glared at the man in front of her. Chapter 602. Before Mara joined the entertainment industry, she was famous for being a bully. She had always been the one bullying others, and no one had ever bullied her before. She was a lowly celebrity in the entertainment industry, but she was good at socializing. She never lacked men. She only focused on earning money. She didn't care if she was able to film shows. As long as she could get money, she didn't care what methods she had to use. But she didn't expect that someone would want to kill her. Her eyes widened even more as she squeezed out the word, why? This man looked so weak before. How did he suddenly turn out like this? Cold murderous intent emanated from his body. He wasn't a normal janitor at all. Blame yourself for messing with people you should never have provoked, Miss Hudson. Someone paid for you to die. Mara had never gotten involved with things like that before. It was only then that she realized the gravity of the situation. This was a lawful society. How could someone be so bold that they would murder others in public? Don't kill me. I'll pay you. I'll give you all my money. But the man simply sneered. As he tightened his grasp, Mara felt herself suffocating. Mara's body kept wriggling in the air. She finally saw the man's eyes beneath the brim of the cap. Those weren't a common man's eyes at all. He was an assassin. In the last few seconds before she died from suffocation, she heard the man say, "This is what you get for snatching things from others. If you owe someone, you'll eventually have to pay up." As all signs of living left her body, it was tossed cruelly onto the ground. The plum blossoms were blooming vividly on the branches. The man broke off a branch and then placed it on her chest. Mara's eyes weren't closed. Her body lay stiffly on the ground, and she stared up at the sky with a twisted expression on her face. Snow danced under the dim streetlights. The woman would never wake up again. "Who is it?" When Kelvin's voice rang out, the man had disappeared into the night. Before he could go after the man, he saw a woman dashing over in panic. Her scream resounded in the night. Help! Murder! Olivia had just arrived home with Ethan. Before she had a chance to remove his makeup, Brent appeared in the living room with an anxious look on his face. "Bad news, Mr. Miller." Olivia, who had walked up to the staircase, paused in her footsteps. "What happened?" Olivia glanced at Brent suspiciously, but he spoke in a calm tone as well. "Yes, Mrs. Miller. I just have some work-related matters to talk to Mr. Miller about." "Don't worry. Don't stay up too late, then." Olivia looked away as she went back to the bedroom. Ethan and Brent walked to the study, one after the other. When the soundproof was closed, Brent finally spoke up. "Bad news. Kelvin was arrested." Ethan didn't panic. "For what reason?" "Your guess was correct, Mr. Miller. There's something wrong with that janitor." When Kelvin went after the janitor, he found Mara dead. Before he could leave the scene, he happened to bump into Mara's manager and driver, who were there to pick her up. They mistook him for the murderer. The culprit chose a blind spot from the surveillance cameras. He's also a professional assassin. Kelvin had appeared at the crime scene, and for the moment, there's no evidence to prove that he's innocent. Chapter 603. Brent looked a little panicked. This matter could either be a trivial issue or a huge incident. Professional assassins would usually lay out the plan beforehand. They would calculate precisely how they would kill the person and deal with the body. They would never expose themselves, nor would they leave any fingerprints. Kelvin was an easygoing person, so that was why he ended up shouldering the blame. "Mr. Miller, that jerk was wearing gloves. There are no fingerprints or any surveillance footage. Kelvin also happened to be at the scene. Even worse, rumors are starting to appear on the internet." Ethan rubbed his wedding ring. In contrast to Brent's urgency, Ethan looked calmer and more reserved. "What rumors?" "Someone posted about the incident between Mrs. Miller and Mara. They claimed that we abuse our power. Even news of Mara's death is making the rounds to oppress others. She's not too famous, but she made quite a fuss shortly before her death. Also, Kelvin was found at the crime scene. People started hinting that we're the ones behind Mara's death. After the news gained traction, they're now convinced that we're the ones who did it. Should I settle this right away?" Ethan lit a cigarette. "Tell the PR department not to deal with any rumors at the moment." "Why? Things have snowballed to this extent in such a short time. If we drag this out, it's going to influence Miller Group's reputation and share prices even more." "2 reasons. Firstly, it has already gotten out of control. People will only think that we're feeling guilty if we spend money to suppress the matter. Before any evidence is found, no one will believe what the PR department says. Secondly, we don't know if someone planned this or if it was a mere coincidence. If we fight back recklessly, we might fall into the trap the enemy laid out beforehand. That'll drag us into the pit." Brent knew that Ethan was right, but he was still worried about Kelvin. "Then what should we do now?" "Look up information on Mara. We've never had anything to do with her, so it doesn't make sense that she would cause trouble for us. Look into her family background and past experiences." "Understood." They couldn't be more familiar with that name. Warren was the main culprit behind the incident that caused Olivia's premature childbirth. Many of Ethan's men were lost in that incident. I wasn't sure about it before, but now, I'm convinced. Even though Warren escaped by luck that night, his leg was injured. He wouldn't have been able to recover in such a short period. In the past few days, Ethan had already issued a warrant for him on the dark web. But there were no traces to be found. Why would Warren kill an unknown celebrity? Didn't the Black Ravens cancel their bounty on Mrs. Miller already? We can't say for sure. Ethan rubbed between his eyebrows. He had a feeling that Warren wasn't targeting Olivia. Too many accidents happened today. No one would have expected Olivia to go to the bathroom at that moment. If she had gone a little earlier or later, she wouldn't have bumped into them. Send someone from the police to ask around. Even if Kelvin appeared at the crime scene, no one has any evidence that he's the one who did it. He won't be charged for now. We still have time. Understood. It was late in the night. Olivia was about to go to sleep when she received a news notification on her phone. When she tapped on it, she saw a blurred photo of Mara's corpse. Chapter 604. On the screen, Mara was shown lying on the snowy ground. Her face was blurred out, so Olivia couldn't make out her expression. Mara was still wearing that dress. Before this, she was causing a ruckus because some water had gotten on it. But now, the dress was covered in snowflakes. Mara was fine just moments ago. Olivia could hardly believe that she died without any warning. Olivia's sleepiness was instantly gone. She tapped into the article and then read it in detail. She saw that Kelvin was involved. She remembered that Ethan seemed to have given Kelvin some orders before they left. Now, Mara was dead, and Kelvin had been caught at the scene. Olivia had an anxious look on her face. Pushing the blanket away, she ran outside. When she opened the door, she ran headfirst into a man's chest. Raising her head, her gaze met Ethan's concerned eyes. "You're not wearing shoes again. Where are you going this late at night?" "Ethan, I saw the news." "Is Kelvin okay?" "He was there at the crime scene, so things have gotten a little tricky. I've already sent someone to look for evidence." Olivia's fingers held his collar lightly. She said in a small voice, "What did you tell him to do before we left?" When Olivia's gaze met Ethan's, she looked away in embarrassment. Ethan lifted her chin, forcing her to look him in the eye. "Tell me, Liv, what sort of person do you think I am?" Olivia met his gaze. After thinking for a moment, she spoke up, "You're gentle and considerate. You're very nice to me. You're a good man." Ethan's thumb gently caressed her lips. Olivia felt a little uncomfortable with the odd sensation on her lips. His gaze was dark, and his tone was low as well. "You're wrong, Liv. I'm nice to you only because I love you. Everything I do is centered around this goal. Of course, I'm not a bad man, but I'm not a good man, either." Olivia's heart raced. Then Mara. "It wasn't me. I won't kill her just for something so petty. I felt that there was something off about the janitor. That's why I asked Kelvin to look into it. In the end, Kelvin was too late. He happened to appear at the scene where the janitor murdered Mara." Olivia sighed in relief. "Do you know that janitor?" Olivia nodded. "All right. By the way, there's one more thing. He said that I saved his sister or something, but I don't remember anything anymore." Ethan didn't want Olivia to get too involved in the matters of the past. He didn't want to stimulate her too much in case they would be leaving Aldenvine in a few days anyway. He had already arranged a medical practice course for Olivia that would last a few years. Olivia wouldn't be going back to the country anytime soon. Before they left, he still had one thing to do. This time, he would be the one taking the initiative. After Ethan comforted her, Olivia finally went to bed. But for some reason, as soon as she closed her eyes, Mara's face appeared in her mind. "Can't sleep. Yeah, I just feel that all this is so unbelievable." Ethan gently caressed her back. "Some people just have it coming. She messed with a professional assassin, which means that someone had paid for her to die. This has nothing to do with you. Back then, the janitor kept telling you not to get involved with this matter. He must have set up a plan to kill her early on, and he didn't want you to ruin it." Olivia muttered to herself, "Who could it be?" Remember, Liv, human hearts are the dirtiest things in the world. They're also the things you should trust the least. Chapter 605. Olivia took a long while to fall asleep. Ethan kept soothing her gently as if he were coaxing a child. She had been acting as usual lately, and there weren't any side effects. But Ethan still felt a little worried. He had read the experimental reports of other patients. They would more or less show some signs of a backlash. But Olivia didn't. This wasn't a good thing. She hadn't experienced any backlash because it wasn't time yet. If it happened, the backlash she experienced might be the worst in history. Ethan felt like there was a bomb planted in his heart, but he didn't know when it would explode. He had never relaxed a day since. Not long after falling asleep, Olivia screamed in his arms. Ah! Ethan instantly opened his eyes. He hugged Olivia tightly, asking, "What's the matter, Liv?" Olivia's body was covered in cold sweat. She trembled uncontrollably. "Blood. I saw lots of blood in my dream." "What else did you see?" "I also heard someone telling me to run away." Subconsciously reaching up, Olivia touched her face as if blood had splattered on it. She felt as if the warmth of the blood still lingered. Ethan didn't miss her movements. He hastily gripped her hands and comforted her. "It's okay, it's just a nightmare. Don't be scared." For a long time, Olivia couldn't calm down. Her fingers clutched his clothes tightly. She looked like a frightened little mouse. This might be one of the side effects. Ethan sighed helplessly. She had already forgotten the terrifying memories, but her body remembered the wounds. Ethan's heart ached as he embraced Olivia tightly. He knew that the unseen wounds might need an entire lifetime to heal. Okay, but now, she felt that the dream was too real. It was so real that she thought she could feel the sensation of the rain mixing. Ethan spent a long time putting Olivia to sleep. She became even more careful than before, and she instinctively curled up. Even in her dreams, she would lean firmly against his arms. The terrible night passed, but an even worse incident happened. Mara's manager revealed that Mara had suffered unfair treatment before she died. Then, her death happened without warning. Mara's manager didn't specifically mention Olivia, but her every word was an accusation toward Olivia. Everyone was paying attention to the incident. So, the medical examiner announced the autopsy results in the middle of the night. It was proven that Mara had died from being strangled. When Mara died, only Kelvin was at the scene. After linking it to the conflict between the two, everyone was now accusing Olivia. In an instant, the negative comments on the internet hurtled toward Olivia like snow. Olivia didn't know about all this. When she woke up, she realized that her phone had gone missing. Ethan was working at the study table. The contours of his profile looked handsome, and he was completely flawless. Rubbing her eyes, Olivia asked, "Ethan, where's my phone?" "It ran out of battery, so I asked someone to take it away and charge it." Olivia was stunned at the obvious excuse. Raising an eyebrow, she asked, "Something happened, right?" Chapter 606. Ethan remembered what had happened last night. So, he decided not to let Olivia receive any more stimulation. But he didn't want her to think that he was deceiving her. He skirted around the issue and said, "There was a small problem. It's the incident with Kelvin. Things are getting out of hand online, so I don't want those trivial matters to upset you." "Is it very tricky?" "Not exactly. I didn't let the PR department do their job because we're still collecting evidence. Some people are trying to make use of the chaos to stir up trouble." Leaning in, Ethan gently pinched her cheek as he spoke lovingly, "You don't have to think about these things. After resolving this issue, we'll be moving overseas. Rest well at home for the next few days, and avoid these negative news articles. I wouldn't want you to get affected by this." Olivia knew that he was doing this for her good. So, she didn't insist on her opinion. "All right, please save Kelvin as soon as possible." "Sure, I have to go out to handle some matters today. Be good and wait for me at home." "Okay." Ethan planted a kiss on her forehead. Then, he turned around and went downstairs. Listening to the sounds of the car starting outside, Olivia saw him off. She wasn't fond of looking at her phone anyway. The biggest role her phone played was to fill in the holes in her memory. Madame Burgess had already prepared a feast for breakfast, and she was even humming in the kitchen. She seemed to be in a good mood as she pulled out the chair for Olivia. "Mrs. Miller, you're so skinny, so you should eat more. When you're overseas, you won't be able to taste my cooking even if you wanted to. I'll miss you so much, Madame Burgess." Madame Burgess had always been a straightforward woman. She was happy at first, but then, she thought about their imminent parting. A look of longing flashed across her face. "I'll miss you too. Mr. Miller suggested that I go overseas with you to take care of you, but I have my children and family as well. For most of my life, I've been rooted to this place. Out there, it's an unfamiliar territory with strangers everywhere. It's also quite inconvenient to go home and visit. So, I had no choice but to decline Mr. Miller's suggestion." As Madame Burgess spoke, she never stopped moving. She served Olivia some food. "But no matter what happens, Mrs. Miller, just trust Mr. Miller. He's the one who loves you the most in this world." She would take good care of Olivia in the last few days so that there would be no regrets. "It's almost New Year's. You can spend New Year's Day with your family this year." After Madame Eugenia passed away, Mr. Miller has been through quite a lot of hardships in recent years. "Madame Burgess, Ethan rarely tells me about his family. What are his parents like?" Mrs. Miller Sr. had always been a little unstable in her mental state. Mr. Miller never received motherly love from her. They rarely meet each other, and even if they spend time together, it'd always be filled with conflict. Olivia asked, "How so?" Madame Burgess pulled up a chair and sat down next to Olivia. "Well, I guess it's not a bad thing for you to hear about these things sooner. You can learn from it, or you'll be at a disadvantage when you get there in the future." Olivia nodded eagerly. "Go on, Madame Burgess." "It all started with Mr. Miller Sr. He was the man who never showed up, and Ethan had never even mentioned him before." "What happened with his dad?" Chapter 607. Don't you find it odd, Mrs. Miller? You've been married into the family for so many years, but you've never met Mr. Miller's parents. To sum it up, Mrs. Miller Sr. isn't the woman Mr. Miller Sr. loves. Mr. Miller Sr.'s heart belonged to someone else. But then, Mrs. Miller Sr. got pregnant with his child with underhanded methods. She thought that Mr. Miller Sr. would change his mind, but he only hated her even more. Thus, he chose to take care of the woman he loved, who was also pregnant then. When Olivia heard about the events, she felt her chest tightening. She felt as if someone was prying open an unseen spot with a needle. What happened after that? Mrs. Miller Sr. had hated that woman from the start. She was shunned by her husband, and she had some hormonal changes during pregnancy. So, Mrs. Miller Sr.'s mental illness worsened. She had depression, but she held on for the sake of her child. On the day she gave birth, she and the other woman had early childbirth at the same time. And Mr. Miller Sr. didn't even hesitate as he chose the other woman. With a loud crash, the bowl of soup in Olivia's hands fell to the floor. It shattered into pieces, and the soup splashed everywhere. "Goodness, Mrs. Miller, what came over you? Did you get burned?" Madame Burgess hastily took some tissues. She wiped the soup that had spilled onto Olivia's feet. Olivia was bewildered for a moment. She felt as if there was once a wound in her heart, and now, someone was opening it by force. The wound hadn't healed yet, but it was now exposed. The old wound had yet to heal, and blood began to drip from it. Olivia lowered her head to look at her feet as if that was her wound. She had no idea what was going on with her. It was someone else's story, so why did she feel like she had gone through the same thing? "I'm fine." What happened to them after that? Madame Burgess threw away the tissues. After making sure that Olivia was fine, she sat down again and continued, "This incident became Mrs. Miller Sr.'s biggest trauma. After giving birth, she seemed to have turned into another person altogether. Mrs. Miller, you're a woman too, so you should know how terrifying postpartum depression can be." Mrs. Miller Sr. was quite pitiful, to be honest. Was she to blame for falling in love with someone? That was why she vented her anger on Mr. Miller. At that, Madame Burgess sighed. "I heard that Mr. Miller was a premature baby, so he was placed in an incubator right after he was born. Then, He was finally taken out and brought to Mrs. Miller Sr. But without any warning, she took him and threw him to the floor. If Madame Eugenia hadn't reacted quickly, Mr. Miller would have been done for. Olivia said, but he's her biological son. Madame Eugenia and the nanny would then take care of Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller was a considerate child from a young age. He wanted to get close to his mother too. But when everyone had let down their guard, Mrs. Miller Sr. suddenly lost her mind. She took Mr. Miller and tried to jump off a building. Did she jump? It's a good thing that they weren't too high up. She jumped from the second floor of the villa, and there was a patch of grass underneath. Mr. Miller was a lucky child, and he only had a minor issue with a leg bone. He recovered after 6 months. Since then, Madame Eugenia never dared to let Mr. Miller get close to Mrs. Miller Sr. Mrs. Miller Sr. had lived a pitiful and hateful life. She had tried to attack Mr. Miller countless times. But Mr. Miller was innocent all along, and he was so young then. Madame Burgess had a sorrowful look on her face. So, Mr. Miller looks like a cold man, but what would you expect? He was born into a family where his parents didn't love him. Even Madame Eugenia, who treated him well, has passed away. To be honest, he has suffered a lot. He only has you now. You're Mr. Miller's family and also the love of his life. Please get along well with him in the future. Chapter 608. Olivia felt a little more sympathetic now. She didn't expect Ethan to have a family background like that. What's it like with the Millers right now? Madame Eugenia's death was a huge shock to her husband, Mr. Harold. He's also quite old, and he has dementia. He has been resting and recuperating overseas since then. He generally doesn't care about what goes on in the family. Olivia asked, then, what about Ethan's father? Back then, he had a strained relationship with Mr. Harold. In his anger, Mr. Harold disowned Mr. Miller Sr. and drove him out of the Miller family. Mr. Miller Sr. started another family a long time ago, and he's living a happy life with the woman he loves. Olivia asked, he doesn't like Mrs. Miller Sr., but doesn't he even care about his son? That's right. To be honest, every man in the Miller family is deeply devoted to love. From Mr. Harold right up to Mr. Miller, and even Mr. Miller Sr., they'd hold on to the person they love for life. But it was just too cruel for Mrs. Miller Sr. and Mr. Miller. Madame Burgess then told Olivia many stories about Ethan's childhood. Olivia was shocked to hear them. To her, all this was a blank canvas. She even had a feeling that Ethan had never once mentioned these things to her. No one would willingly open their wounds and expose them to someone else. Seeing the dark expression on Olivia's face, Madame Burgess slowly lightened her tone. Don't think about it too much, Mrs. Miller. All those things I said are trivial stuff in the past now. It has been more than 20 years since then. Even rivers can dry up in that period. Mrs. Miller Sr. must have let go of it a long time ago. I heard that she's recovering well, and she even asked to meet Mr. Miller. She must be just like everyone else by now. Olivia replied, I see. Olivia and Madame Burgess chatted for a long while. They were at least acquaintances, after all. So, Olivia decided to buy something for Madame Burgess. After getting ready, the two went out under the protection of bodyguards. Meanwhile, Ethan was in the president's office at Miller Group. He had a grave look on his face as he looked at the screen. It was filled with dishonest news and angry fans. Topics like, Miller Group kills at will, and, Mrs. Miller forced a celebrity to death, kept popping up. Mr. Miller, I found something. A foreign force is making use of this incident to blow things up. They're blaming everything on Mrs. Miller. They're fanning the flames of the innocent crowd's anger. None for now, but Mara did die because someone had paid for it to happen. According to the information, Mara's private life is a mess. She doesn't care for morality or shame at all. Ethan lit a cigarette. Continue. She somehow got lucky and entered the entertainment industry. She didn't join the industry to act, though. She was just there to earn money. She extorted many people, and she only targeted laborers. He had already planned the killing method and location. Ethan shook off the cigarette ashes. A dark shadow loomed over his face. So, Warren wasn't targeting Liv. As you've guessed, no. Mara probably seduced a man she shouldn't have, so the man's wife got upset with her. Then, the wife hired someone to kill Mara. Mrs. Miller and Kelvin somehow got involved by accident. Some people with ulterior motives heard of it, and they're using it to cause controversy and trouble. Ethan pondered aloud. Who could it be? Chapter 609. I looked into the provocative posts. The IP addresses are from different areas around the globe, but they were posted at the same time. It's the work of a professional hacker. They could achieve so much in such a short time after the incident. They must be quite skilled. Brent's expression stiffened. Mr. Miller, are you suspecting the person behind the hired assassination? Yes. They could afford the $100 million to hire up to 100 people from the Black Ravens. They could also get hackers to direct the netizens right after the incident happened. Other than power and wealth, this person also has malicious intentions. They're nowhere near righteous either. Ethan frowned deeply. After investigating it for so long, they still hadn't found any clues. The person was very careful, and they would prepare a way out beforehand every time. Even if someone tried to investigate, they would only be met with an unrelated corpse in the end. Who did Mrs. Miller offend? Why would they try so hard to kill her? They're probably setting things up for the next part of their plan. We have to resolve the situation as soon as possible. Brent sighed. They don't have evidence to prove that Kelvin isn't the culprit for now, but he was at the crime scene, after all. Also, there's a clear motive, so the police won't let him off anytime soon. Warren must have gone into hiding by now. This is a dead end. Ethan responded, that may not be the case. Since the incident started because of Mara, we have to look into her history. We have to figure out who it was that paid for her to die. But Mr. Miller, even if we find out who it was, they wouldn't just admit that they had killed Mara, would they? No, but at least we'd have some grounds for negotiation. That person might have some evidence on hand. When Ethan said that, Brent's eyes lit up. I get it now. I'll send someone to look into it right away. Mara had slept with a few men recently, so we should find something if we investigate their wives. Yeah, Ethan rubbed between his eyebrows, feeling tired. Olivia's enemy was far more skilled than he had imagined. He decided that they should leave the country in secret. He had just given some orders when Brent hurried in again. Bad news, Mr. Miller. Our chain shopping malls in various areas are in trouble. Ethan's closed eyes immediately shot open. Speak. Mara's fans have gathered around. They started causing trouble at the properties belonging to Miller Group. Look, people were even holding banners, demanding apologies from Ethan and Olivia. Some even went to the extreme, wanting the couple to compensate with their lives. So, while we're struggling to find evidence, they took the initiative to attack us. They're trying to take the opportunity to uproot Miller Group. Our utmost priority right now is to stay calm. Send an announcement. If it's necessary to involve the police, tell them to file a report. Compensate the lawyer teams if they ask for it. As soon as he had evidence, he could start his retaliation. He would take back double the things he lost. Of course, the most important mission is to tell Madame Burgess to keep an eye on Liv. Don't let her go out. As long as Liv doesn't reveal herself in public, I'll be able to deal with this issue swiftly. Brent dialed a bodyguard's number. Then, his expression changed. Mr. Miller, Mrs. Miller went to a mall with Madame Burgess not long ago. Damn it. Olivia didn't have a phone, so she didn't know how messed up things had become outside. If she went out right now, she would only be targeted. Find out where they went. I'll be right there. Ethan grabbed his coat and then hurriedly tried to leave. But when he opened the door, he saw police officers standing there expressionlessly. Mr. Miller, I'm the leader of the Criminal Investigation Division, Xavier Harper. You're suspected of being involved in a murder case. Please come with us to cooperate with the investigation. Chapter 610. Ethan said coldly, I have a very important matter to deal with right now. If you have anything to say, talk to my assistant. He was about to leave when Xavier stepped forward, blocking his path. Sorry, Mr. Miller. The murder case aside, someone also reported your company for tax evasion and other issues. You have to come with us. Someone was trying to delay him with these things at this particular moment. A trace of impatience appeared on Ethan's calm face. If you have anything to say, just talk to my lawyer and assistant. Step aside. Xavier took out a pair of handcuffs right away. Mr. Miller, if you refuse to cooperate, we'll have to do this the hard way. The law enforcement recorder is running right now. Please follow the procedure. I said, get lost. Lifting his hand, Ethan was about to strike Xavier. Xavier didn't dodge either. It was as if he was waiting for Ethan to get mad. Brent hastily took a step forward, stopping Ethan. He gave Ethan a look. Mr. Miller, they're just following procedures. You should go first. Leave the rest to me. Things were already chaotic enough, but now, Ethan was even accused of tax evasion. Someone was pulling strings in the shadows just to stir up even more trouble. Ethan was prone to losing his sense of reason when Olivia was involved. If he was charged with assault on a police officer, it would complicate things even more. Ethan recovered his calm. He couldn't mess up at a moment like this. All right, I'll leave it to you. Don't worry, Mr. Miller. Brent had just finished speaking when Xavier blocked Brent's path as well. Sorry, Mr. Ingram, but you have to come with us for the investigation as well. Someone has also reported your company for falsifying accounts, among other illegal activities. Ethan's eyes widened. He couldn't suppress the cold air emanating from him anymore. Reaching out, he gripped Xavier's collar. Don't think I don't recognize you, Mr. Harper. Quit acting all high and mighty here. Their gazes met, and their eyes were filled with confrontational looks. I thought you wouldn't remember these things, Mr. Miller. You're an important figure, after all. It's a good thing that you remember. I told you that you'd better wish you didn't fall into my hands. Mr. Miller. Brent coughed. He feared that they would get into a conflict, and someone would use this incident against Ethan. Ethan glanced at the running law enforcement recorder. They had come prepared. He suppressed his anger. Lead the way. Olivia and Madame Burgess arrived at the mall. Madame Burgess earned quite a lot every year, but she was quite frugal so that she could give more money to her family. Mrs. Miller, I already told you. You don't have to do this. The things here are frighteningly expensive. I can buy things online, and they're not too expensive either. I can't possibly accept a gift from you. Madame Burgess smiled. Then, allow me to thank you on his behalf, Mrs. Miller. Small cute clothes filled their vision. Reaching out, Olivia subconsciously touched her flat belly. Olivia finally returned to her senses. I'm fine. Let's go and pick something out. I'll pay for it. I'll take your word for it, then. Madame Burgess happily hurried into the clothing department. Olivia watched the future fathers and mothers picking out items for their babies. She felt a little sad. She was supposed to have a child too. Suddenly, a baby's cry sounded in her ears. Olivia's motherly instincts were activated as she looked up toward the sound. She saw a man in a mask who was wearing a thick down jacket. He was pushing a double stroller. He picked up the crying baby, coaxing them patiently. He had a tall and huge figure, but he seemed to be quite skilled with these things. But he had just picked up one baby when the other started crying as well. Olivia didn't know what came over her, but she began walking toward the child.